7 black SUVs. That is what pulled up to Ada Okonkwo's front yard on a Tuesday afternoon in March. 7 polished, gleaming machines that looked like they had been cut from a different world entirely and dropped into the cracked, sun-beaten roads of Ikenna, a small town tucked into the green hills of Ogun State, Nigeria. Ada stood on her porch, her fingers still damp from washing cassava in the basin behind the house. Her 11-year-old daughter, Zuri, pressed against her hip, eyes wide and unblinking. Neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. The doors of the first SUV opened simultaneously, and 4 men in dark suits stepped out. They moved with military precision, scanning the area as if the small compound of plantain trees and rusted zinc roofing posed some kind of threat. Then the second vehicle opened, and a woman in a tailored cream-colored suit stepped out. She wore sunglasses that probably cost more than Ada earned in 6 months of selling vegetables at the Ikan market. The woman removed her sunglasses and looked directly at Ada. Her expression was not hostile. It was something worse. It was calculated. It was the look of someone who had already decided how this encounter would end before it even began. Woman in cream suit. Are you the one they call Ada? The woman who has been sheltering a man you found on the roadside 3 months ago? Ada's throat tightened. She thought about the man inside her house, the man who could not remember his own name, the man who had stumbled into her life broken, bleeding, and confused, and who had somehow, without either of them planning it, become the closest thing to family she had known in years. She swallowed hard and straightened her back. Ada, I did not shelter him. I saved his life. There is a difference. The woman in the cream suit tilted her head, studying Ada the way a jeweler studies a stone, trying to determine if it is real or costume. But before anyone could say another word, the door of the 7th SUV opened, and everything Ada thought she knew about the man sleeping in her back room was about to collapse like a house built on water. Now, let us rewind. Because this story does not begin with 7 SUVs. It does not begin with a convoy of bodyguards, or a woman in a cream suit asking questions she already knew the answers to. This story begins on a rainy night, on a road that most GPS systems have forgotten, with a woman who had every reason to keep walking and a stranger who had every reason to die. 3 months before those SUVs arrived, Ada Okonkwo's life was a quiet exercise in survival. She was 34 years old, a widow, and the sole provider for her daughter Zuri and her aging mother, Mama Nkechi, who had been battling chronic arthritis for the past 7 years. Ada lived in a 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Ikenna. The house had belonged to her late husband, Emeka, who had died 4 years earlier from complications after a motorcycle accident. He had been a secondary school teacher, a man who believed that education was the bridge between poverty and possibility. When he died, Ada inherited his philosophy but not his salary. The pension never came. The promises from the local government dissolved like sugar in rain. So Ada did what millions of women in her position do across the world. She adapted. She survived. She woke every morning at 4:30, walked 2 kilometers to the stream to fetch water, prepared breakfast for Zuri and Mama Nkechi, and then loaded her wheelbarrow with vegetables to sell at the Ikene market. On a good day, she made about 2,500 naira. On a bad day, she came home with wilted greens and an empty pocket. But Ada never complained. Not once. Not to her neighbors, not to her mother, and certainly not to Zuri. She believed that complaining was a luxury reserved for people who had other options. She did not, so she worked. There is something the world often overlooks about women like Ada. Society measures wealth in bank accounts, in property, in the cars you drive and the clothes you wear. But there is another kind of wealth, one that cannot be deposited or withdrawn, and that is the wealth of character. Ada was rich in compassion. She was wealthy in dignity, and she carried herself with a grace that money could never manufacture. Her neighbors respected her. The market women saved the best tomatoes for her. The children in the neighborhood called her Auntie Ada, and she always had a kind word for every one of them. In a world that had given her very little, she gave back everything she had. But there was one thing Ada quietly longed for, though she never said it out loud. She longed for someone to see her, not just as a market woman, not just as a widow, not just as Zuri's mother or Mama Nkechi's daughter, She wanted someone to look at her and see the full person she was. The woman who used to dream of attending university. The woman who once wanted to be a journalist. The woman who still read borrowed novels by candlelight when the electricity went out, which was almost every night. That longing was a quiet flame inside her chest. She never fed it, but she never extinguished it either. And it was that same compassion, that same unshakable instinct to care for others, that would lead her to make a decision on a rainy Thursday night in December that would alter the trajectory of her entire existence. It was raining, the kind of rain that does not ask permission, the kind that hits the zinc roof like 1,000 tiny fists and turns every unpaved road into a river of red mud. Ada was walking home from the market that evening, her unsold vegetables wrapped in a damp cloth and balanced on her head. The path she took was a shortcut through the bush, a narrow trail that wound past an abandoned cocoa farm and eventually connected to the main road near her house. She almost did not see him. At first, she thought it was a fallen log. The rain was so heavy that visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and the darkness of the bush made everything blend into shadow. But then the log moved, and Ada stopped. A man lay face down in the mud, half hidden by elephant grass on the side of the trail. He was wearing what had once been an expensive shirt, now torn and soaked through with blood and rainwater. His shoes were gone. His face was pressed into the earth, and for a horrible moment, Ada thought he was dead. She knelt down, her heart hammering against her ribs, and pressed 2 fingers against his neck the way she had once seen a nurse do at the community health center. There it was, a pulse, faint, irregular, but present. This man was alive. Now, most people in Ada's position would have done one of 2 things. They would have either run to the nearest house and called for help, or they would have kept walking, reasoning that this was not their problem and that getting involved with an unknown, bloodied man on a dark road at night was an invitation for trouble. Both responses would have been perfectly rational. Ada did neither. She put down her vegetables. She crouched in the mud. She grabbed the man under his arms and began to drag him toward the road. He was heavy, easily twice her weight, and the mud sucked at her feet like it was trying to hold her in place. She slipped twice, landing hard on her knees, but each time she got back up and kept pulling. It took her almost 45 minutes to get him to her house. By the time she dragged him through the front door and onto the mat in her living room, she was covered in mud, her arms were trembling, and she could barely breathe. Mama Nkechi looked up from her chair in the corner and stared. Mama Nkechi, Ada, what have you brought into this house? Ada, a man, Mama. He is hurt. He needs help. Mama Nkechi, and since when did you become a hospital? Ada did not answer. She was already tearing strips from an old wrapper to use as bandages. The man had a deep gash on his forehead, several cuts on his arms, and what looked like a fractured rib based on the way he groaned when she touched his side. There was no hospital within 40 kilometers that she could afford, and the local clinic had closed at 5 o'clock. So Ada did what she had always done. She used what she had. She boiled water. She cleaned the wounds with a mixture of warm water and salt. She applied a poultice of bitter leaf and shea butter that Mama Nkechi reluctantly helped her prepare, grumbling the entire time about daughters who had more heart than sense. She wrapped his ribs with strips of cloth and elevated his head with folded blankets. By midnight, the rain had stopped and the man was resting. His breathing had steadied. The bleeding had slowed. Ada sat on the floor beside him, exhausted, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering who he was, where he had come from, and how he had ended up broken and abandoned on a bush path in the middle of nowhere. She did not know it yet, but the man lying on her floor was Chidinma Adeyemi, the 38-year-old founder and chief executive officer of Adeyemi Holdings, a conglomerate worth over 900 billion naira, with interests in oil, real estate, shipping, and technology. He was the 7th richest man in West Africa. His face had been on the cover of Forbes Africa twice. His company employed over 12,000 people across 15 countries. And right now, he did not even know his own name. He opened his eyes 2 days later. Ada was sitting at the small wooden table near the window, peeling yams for the afternoon meal, when she heard a low groan from the corner of the room. She turned and found him staring at the ceiling, his eyes glassy and confused, his lips cracked and dry. She brought him water in a tin cup and held it to his lips while he drank. He drank like a man who had been wandering through a desert, desperate, urgent, as if his body was trying to remember how to function. When he finished, he looked at her, really looked at her, and the first words he spoke were not his name. They were not a question about where he was or what had happened. The first words out of his mouth were something Ada would never forget. The stranger, "Thank you." It was such a simple thing, 2 words, but the way he said them carried a weight that went beyond politeness. It was as if those 2 words were the only thing he was certain of in that moment. Everything else, his identity, his past, his purpose, was lost in a fog he could not see through. But gratitude, that, he still had. Ada nodded and set the cup down. "Ada, you have been asleep for 2 days. You were badly hurt when I found you. Can you tell me your name?" The man's brow furrowed. His eyes moved around the room as if searching for something. A clue, a trigger, anything that might unlock the door to his memory. But there was nothing. The room was bare. A wooden table, 2 plastic chairs, a kerosene lamp, a calendar from 2 years ago pinned to the wall. Nothing in this room belonged to his world, though he did not know that yet. The stranger, "I do not know. I cannot remember anything. Not my name, not where I came from. I do not even know how I got here." Ada studied his face. He was not lying. She had spent enough years in the market reading people, watching their eyes when they haggled, when they made promises, when they lied, to know the difference between deception and genuine confusion. This man was lost. Not geographically lost, though he was that too. He was lost inside himself. The corridors of his own mind had gone dark, and he was stumbling through them with his hands outstretched, touching nothing. Medical science calls this retrograde amnesia, a condition where damage to the brain, often caused by severe trauma, disrupts the ability to recall previously stored memories. The injury to the man's head, that deep gash on his forehead, was consistent with a high-impact collision. His memories had not been erased. They were locked behind a door that his injured brain could no longer open. In some cases, these memories return gradually. In others, they never come back at all. Ada did not know any of this. She only knew that a man with no name and no memory was lying in her house, and he needed help. "Ada, it is all right. You do not need to remember right now. You are safe here. My name is Ada. You are in Ikena, in Ogun State. I found you on the road 2 nights ago. You were bleeding. I brought you home." The man absorbed this information slowly, the way dry earth absorbs the first rain of the season. Each word sank in, but it did not fill the emptiness. The stranger, "You found me on the road and you brought me into your home. You do not even know who I am. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous." "Ada, you could be, but you are also dying. And where I come from, we do not leave people to die on the road because of what they might be." Mama Nkechi, who had been listening from the doorway, shook her head slowly and muttered something under her breath about daughters who collected stray human beings the way other people collected stray cats. But even she, for all her grumbling, brought the stranger a bowl of pepper soup that evening without being asked. The first week was the hardest. The man could not walk without leaning on something. His ribs sent jolts of pain through his body every time he breathed too deeply, and the headaches came in waves, sudden blinding episodes that left him gripping the sides of his head and clenching his jaw so tightly Ada worried his teeth would crack. Ada cared for him with the same quiet determination she applied to everything in her life. She changed his bandages twice a day. She prepared meals that were soft enough for him to eat without too much effort. Yam porridge seasoned with crayfish, light soups with vegetables from her garden. She gave him her late husband Emeka's old clothes, a pair of trousers, and 2 shirts that were slightly too short in the arms but otherwise fit well enough. Zuri.
"Where am I? Who are I?"
Who are you?
Zuri, Ada's daughter, was fascinated by the stranger. Children have an uncanny ability to sense the character of a person long before adults figure it out. While Mama Nkechi watched the man with cautious suspicion and Ada treated him with careful compassion, Zuri simply walked up to him on the 3rd day, sat on the floor beside his mat, and opened her school exercise book. "Zuri, can you help me with my mathematics homework?" My mother tries, but she always gets confused by the fractions. The man looked at the page. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not a memory exactly, but a sensation, a feeling of familiarity. He picked up the pencil Zuri offered him, and, without understanding how or why he knew what he knew, began to explain the concept of fractions with a clarity that startled everyone in the room, including himself. He did not just explain fractions. He broke down the logic behind them in a way that made Zuri's eyes light up with understanding. He drew diagrams. He used examples involving sharing oranges and cutting fabric. He made mathematics feel less like a punishment and more like a puzzle. Zuri, you are a very good teacher. Are you a teacher? Maybe that is who you are. The man smiled for the first time since he had arrived. It was a cautious smile, uncertain, like the first rays of sunlight after a long storm. The stranger, maybe I am. I do not know, but I am glad I could help. Ada watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway, and something shifted inside her. It was not romantic. Not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was recognition. She saw in this broken, nameless man the same quality her late husband Emeka had possessed. The ability to make knowledge feel like a gift rather than a burden. Emeka had believed that teaching was an act of love, and watching this stranger explain fractions to her daughter with patience and genuine care, Ada felt, for the first time in years, that the universe might still be paying attention. Since the man had no name and no memory to build one from, Zuri decided to solve the problem herself. Zuri, we cannot keep calling you the stranger. I'm going to give you a name. I will call you Obiora. It means the heart of the people, because you have a good heart, I can tell. And just like that, the nameless billionaire CEO of a 900-billion-naira empire became Obiora, a man with a borrowed name, borrowed clothes, and a borrowed life, living in a house that had no running water and no electricity for 16 hours a day. And for reasons he could not explain, it felt right. Over the next several weeks, something remarkable happened. Not a sudden dramatic transformation, but a slow, organic shift that crept into the household the way dawn creeps into a dark room, gradually, gently, until everything is illuminated. Obiora, as the stranger was now called, began to heal. His ribs mended. His headaches became less frequent. The gash on his forehead closed into a thin scar that ran along his hairline like a secret. But while his body recovered, his memory remained stubbornly locked. Flashes came occasionally, brief images that appeared and vanished like lightning. A boardroom, a skyline, the scent of expensive cologne, the sound of someone calling a name he could not quite hear. But nothing held. Nothing stayed long enough for him to grasp. Without his past, Obiora had no choice but to exist entirely in the present, and the present was Ada's world. A world of early mornings and hard work, of scarcity managed with creativity, of love expressed through action rather than words. He began to help around the house. At first, it was small things. Fetching water from the stream, so Ada did not have to make the 2-kilometer walk. Repairing the broken hinge on the kitchen door, fixing the leak in the zinc roof that had been dripping into a bucket in the corner of the living room for the past 8 months. Ada protested at first. Ada, you are still recovering. You should not be doing heavy work. Obiora, you carried me through the rain on your back for nearly an hour. The least I can do is fix a leaking roof. Ada had no answer for that. As the days passed, Obiora's contributions grew. He helped Zuri with her homework every evening, turning the kitchen table into a classroom. He listened to Mama Nkechi's stories about the old days with genuine interest, something her own grandchildren, scattered across different cities, rarely had the patience to do. He even began accompanying Ada to the market, helping her carry vegetables and arrange her stall. The market women noticed him immediately. A tall, broad-shouldered man with an unmistakable air of refinement, even in borrowed clothes and worn sandals, standing beside Ada at her vegetable stall. Tongues began to wag before the first tomato was sold. Aya Bos, a market woman. Ada, who is this fine man you are hiding? Is he your new husband? Where did you find him? Ada's cheeks burned. Ada, he is not my husband. He is a guest. He is helping me because he is kind, and that is all. But the way she said it, the slight tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted to the ground before she answered, told a different story. And Ia Bose, who had been reading women's hearts for over 50 years, simply smiled and said nothing more. Obiora, meanwhile, was experiencing something he had no framework to understand. In his previous life, the one locked behind the damaged walls of his memory, he had been surrounded by people at all times. Personal assistants, board members, investors, security personnel, society women who wanted to be seen on his arm, business rivals who wanted to see him fail. His world had been crowded with people, but not one of them had ever sat with him in the dark during a headache episode, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead and humming a soft Igbo lullaby until the pain passed. Not one of them had ever handed him a plate of food and said simply, "Eat," with the kind of quiet authority that left no room for refusal or pretense. Not one of them had ever looked at him and seen just a man, not a brand, not a balance sheet, not a power move, just a man. Ada did all of these things without realizing how extraordinary they were. To her, it was just life. You find someone who is hurt, you help them, you feed them, you treat them with dignity. That was not heroism, that was Tuesday. But to Obiora, it was a revelation, and slowly, like a river carving a path through stone, something began to grow between them. It was not declared, it was not discussed, it simply existed. In the way he looked at her when she was not watching, in the way she smiled when he made Zuri laugh, in the way their hands occasionally brushed while working side by side and neither of them pulled away. Here is something that deserves to be said plainly, because the world often dresses it up in sentimentality and misses the raw truth underneath. Poverty is expensive, not just financially, but emotionally, physically, and spiritually. It costs energy, it costs time, it costs dignity. When you are poor, every decision is a calculation. Every naira matters. Every meal is planned not around desire, but around what you can afford. Ada took Obiora into her home, knowing full well that her resources were already stretched to their breaking point. She was already feeding 3 people on a budget that barely supported 2. She was already rationing kerosene, already wearing clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more patch than cloth. Adding another mouth to feed was not a small thing. It was a significant sacrifice, and she made it without hesitation. But sacrifice has a weight, and over time, that weight makes itself known. By the second month, the strain was showing. Ada began skipping meals, telling Zuri and Mama Nkechi that she had already eaten at the market when she had not. She walked farther to find cheaper sources of firewood. She reduced her own portion so that Obiora could have a full plate, and when he noticed and tried to give some back, she refused with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. Obiora, Ada, you are not eating enough. I can see it. Your hands are thinner. Your eyes are tired. You are giving me food that should be yours. Ada, I am fine. I have been living on less than this for years. You are still healing. Your body needs the nutrition more than mine does right now. Obiora, that is not the point and you know it. You are hurting yourself to help me. I will not allow it. Ada, you will not allow it. With all due respect, Obiora, you are a guest in my house wearing my late husband's trousers. You do not get to allow or disallow anything. The words came out sharper than she intended, and the moment they left her mouth, she regretted them. Not because they were untrue, but because the look on Obiora's face told her they had landed somewhere deep and tender. He was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was low, measured, and heavy with a vulnerability she had not heard from him before. Obiora, you are right. I have nothing. I am nothing right now. I do not know who I am or where I belong. The only thing I know for certain is that you saved my life, and every day you continue to sacrifice for me, and I have no way to repay you. That is not a comfortable feeling, Ada. It is not comfortable to be a burden to someone you respect. Ada sat down across from him. The kerosene lamp flickered between them, casting long shadows on the wall. Outside, crickets sang their endless night chorus. Ada, you are not a burden. A burden is something you carry because you have no choice. You are here because I chose to help you. There is a difference. And as for repayment, the world does not always work that way. Sometimes someone helps you, and you pass that help forward to the next person who needs it. That is how communities survive. That is how people survive. This is a truth that modern society often forgets in its obsession with transactions. Every act of kindness does not require a receipt. Every good deed does not need a return on investment. Sometimes the purpose of generosity is simply generosity itself. It is the thread that holds the fabric of humanity together, and when we pull on that thread, demanding repayment, demanding recognition, demanding something in return, the whole cloth unravels. Obiora absorbed Ada's words in silence. Something about them echoed inside the hollow chambers of his lost memory, as if the person he used to be was listening to and learning something he should have known all along. The first real crack in the wall of Obiora's amnesia appeared 7 weeks after his arrival. It happened without warning, as these things often do. Ada had taken him to the small electronics repair shop on the edge of the Ikenne market. The shop belonged to a man named Femi, who fixed radios, charged phones, and occasionally let people use his old desktop computer for a small fee. Ada needed to charge her phone, which was a simple Nokia device she used primarily to receive messages from the school about Zuri's fees. While they waited, Femi was struggling with a spreadsheet on his computer. He was trying to track his inventory and expenses, but the columns were not calculating correctly, and the formulas kept returning errors that made no sense to him. Obiora watched from across the counter. Something stirred inside him, a pull, an instinct, like a musician who has forgotten his name but hears a melody and finds his fingers moving toward the instrument without conscious thought. Obiora, may I take a look? Femi shrugged and stepped aside. Obiora sat down at the computer and began to work. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a fluency that startled everyone, including himself. Within 20 minutes, he had not only fixed the spreadsheet, but had restructured the entire system, creating a simple but elegant tracking model that categorized expenses, calculated profit margins, projected monthly earnings, and flagged items that were not generating returns. Femi stared at the screen with his mouth open. Femi, brother, who are you? This is the kind of thing those big company people do. Where did you learn this? Obiora stared at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. He had no idea where the knowledge came from. It had simply poured out of him like water from a tap that someone else had turned on. Obiora, I do not know. I honestly do not know. Ada watched this scene unfold with a mixture of awe and unease. Awe because she was witnessing something extraordinary. Unease because the man sitting at that computer, the man who had just casually built a business management system in 20 minutes, was clearly not an ordinary person. Whatever his life had been before that rainy night on the road, it was not the life of a farmer or a school teacher or a trader. This man's hands carried a knowledge that came from a world far removed from Ikenne, and that realization introduced a question Ada had been deliberately avoiding since the day she brought him home. A question that sat in the corner of her mind like a shadow she refused to turn around and face. What happens when he remembers? Because if Obiora remembered who he was, he would also remember where he belonged, and wherever that was, Ada was almost certain it was not here. Love has a peculiar way of announcing itself. It does not always arrive with grand gestures and dramatic declarations. Sometimes it shows up in the smallest moments, in the quiet spaces between ordinary actions, and by the time you recognize it for what it has already planted roots too deep to pull out. For Ada and Obiora, love did not announce itself at all. It simply materialized, the way dew appears on grass in the morning. You do not see it form. You only see it when the light hits it at the right angle. It was in the way Obiora began waking up before Ada to start the fire so the water would be warm by the time she rose. It was in the way Ada began unconsciously preparing his favorite meals, ground nut soup with dried fish and pounded yam, more often than she used to. It was in the way they fell into a rhythm of working side by side, speaking little but communicating everything, the way people do when their spirits have learned each other's language. One evening, about 10 weeks into his stay, Ada was sitting on the porch, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The sky was a canvas of orange and purple, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the sweet scent of ripening mangoes. Obiora came and sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They did not need to. The silence between them had become its own conversation, comfortable, warm, full. Then Obiora said something that changed the temperature of everything. Obiora, Ada, I want you to know something. I may never remember who I was. The doctors at the clinic said the memory might come back, or it might not. And I have been thinking about that. I have been thinking about what it means to lose your entire past and have nothing to hold on to except the present. He paused. Ada kept her eyes on the horizon, but every cell in her body was listening. Obiora, and what I have realized is this. Whoever I was before, whatever life I lived, it could not have been better than this. Because this, right here, this porch, this sky, you, Zuri, even Mama, Nikechi's sharp tongue. This is the first time I have felt like I belong somewhere. I do not have a memory to compare it to, but I do not need one. I know what peace feels like. I feel it here. Ada's eyes glistened. She did not look at him. She could not, because if she looked at him right now, she would not be able to stop the feeling that was pressing against the inside of her chest, like a bird trying to break free of a cage. Ada, you say that now because you do not know what you are missing. When your memory returns, you might feel differently. Obiora, and you say that because you are afraid. You are afraid that if I remember I will leave. And you have already lost one person you cared about, and you are not sure your heart can survive it again. The accuracy of his words hit her like a physical blow. She turned to look at him, and in his eyes she saw no manipulation, no agenda, no performance. She saw a man who had been stripped of everything, his name, his history, his wealth, his power, and who was offering her the only thing he had left, his honesty. Ada, I am afraid. I will not lie to you about that. But I am also not foolish. This situation, whatever it is between us, it has an expiration date. You do not belong here, Obiora. I do not know where you belong, but it is not in a house with no electricity and a leaking roof. You are meant for something bigger. I felt it the day you fixed Femi's computer. I feel it every time you speak. You carry something inside you that is larger than this place, and one day, that something is going to come looking for you. Obiora reached over and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched, deliberately, intentionally, without the excuse of a bandage change or an accidental brush. His hand was large and warm, and her hand, calloused from years of market work, fit inside it like it had always been meant to rest there. Obiora, then let that day come when it comes. But until it does, let me be here. Let me be present. Let me be grateful. And let me care about you without having to pretend that I do not. Ada did not pull her hand away. She did not say yes, and she did not say no. She simply let the moment exist, unresolved and honest, the way real love often does. Mama Nkechi, watching from behind the kitchen curtain, wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered to no one in particular, Emeka, if you are watching from wherever you are, I think your wife is going to be all right. While Ada and Obiora were building something beautiful in the quiet margins of a small town, 400 kilometers away in Lagos, a very different story was unfolding. One built not on love, but on greed, betrayal, and the cold mathematics of corporate power. Chidinma Adeyemi had not simply vanished. He had been made to vanish. 3 months earlier, on the night of the accident, Chidinma had been traveling from Lagos to Abeokuta for a confidential meeting with a whistleblower who had evidence of financial fraud within Adeyemi Holdings. The fraud had been orchestrated by two people Chidinma had trusted implicitly, his chief financial officer, Victor Namdi, and his younger cousin and vice president of operations, Tobechukwu Adeyemi, known to everyone as Tobe. Victor and Toba had been siphoning funds from the company for over 2 years, routing payments through ghost contracts and offshore accounts. The total amount stolen was estimated at 47 billion naira. When they discovered that Chidinma was on his way to meet the whistleblower, they made a decision that crossed the line from white-collar crime into something far darker. They arranged for his car to be run off the road. The plan was not necessarily to kill him, though they would not have mourned if it had. The plan was to delay him, to create chaos, to buy enough time to destroy the evidence and silence the whistleblower. The hired men ran Chidinma's vehicle off the Lagos-Ibadan expressway near the Sagamu interchange. The car flipped twice and came to rest in a ditch off the service road. Chidinma's driver was killed instantly. Chidinma himself was thrown from the vehicle and landed in the bush several meters from the wreckage. The hired men checked the car, found the driver dead, assumed Chidinma was somewhere in the wreckage as well, and left. They did not find him because the rain had already begun, and the bush was thick, and they were men who were paid to cause an accident, not to conduct a thorough search. So Chidinma, bleeding and unconscious, was left on the side of the road. He lay there for hours before somehow, through sheer biological will, his body began to move. Concussed, disoriented, and operating on pure survival instinct, he stumbled and crawled for what must have been kilometers before collapsing on the bush path where Ada found him. Back in Lagos, Victor and Tobe executed the second phase of their plan with surgical precision. They reported the accident to the police and the media, but they controlled the narrative. They told the world that Chidinma Adeyemi had been in a tragic car accident and that his body had not yet been recovered. They expressed public grief. They wore black. They held a press conference where Tobe, standing behind a podium with tears in his eyes, declared that the company would honor Chidinma's legacy and that he, as the next of kin in the company's succession plan, would assume the role of interim CEO. The board, most of whom had been carefully cultivated by Victor over the previous 2 years, voted to approve the transition, and just like that, a living man was declared effectively dead, and his empire was stolen from him while he lay on a stranger's floor, unable to remember his own name. This is how betrayal works in the real world. It does not come from your enemies. Your enemies stand in front of you, visible and honest in their opposition. Betrayal comes from the people standing beside you, the ones who smile at your table, the ones who call you brother, the ones you trusted with the keys to the kingdom because you believed that blood and loyalty were the same thing. They are not. Loyalty is a choice. Blood is an accident. The thread that would eventually unravel Victor and Toby's carefully constructed lie began with a woman named Chidinma Eze. She was Chidinma's executive assistant and had worked with him for 6 years. She was the kind of employee every CEO dreams of: competent, discreet, fiercely loyal, and possessed of a memory that bordered on supernatural. Chidinma did not believe Chidinma was dead. She could not explain why. It was not evidence-based. It was not logical. It was a feeling, the kind that sits in your gut and refuses to leave, no matter how many reasonable arguments you throw at it. She had noticed things in the weeks before the accident, whispered conversations between Victor and Tobe that stopped abruptly when she entered the room, files that were moved from shared drives to private folders, a meeting between Victor and a lawyer who specialized in offshore financial structures. Individually, each of these observations was insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that made her uneasy. After the accident, Chidinma did something that would have gotten her fired if anyone had found out. She began copying files, not from the company's servers, which Victor had already begun to sanitize, but from the physical records in the archive room in the basement of the Adeyemi Holdings headquarters. She worked after hours, photographing documents with her phone, building a shadow archive that she stored on an encrypted drive, hidden inside a hollowed-out hardcover novel on her bookshelf at home. She also did something else. She hired a private investigator, not a high-end Lagos detective, because those could be bought. She hired a retired police officer from Abeokuta named Sergeant Danladi, a man with no connections to the corporate world and no interest in anything except the truth and a steady paycheck. Sergeant Danladi spent 5 weeks retracing the route of Chidinma's car on the night of the accident. He visited the crash site. He spoke to tow truck operators. He visited local hospitals and clinics within a 100-kilometer radius, showing Chidinma's photograph to nurses and doctors. Nothing. Then he expanded his search to include traditional healers, chemists, and community health workers in the rural areas surrounding the crash site. And in the 7th week of his search, he walked into a small pharmacy in Ikenne and showed the photograph to the pharmacist. The pharmacist squinted at the photo and said words that would change everything. "Pharmacist, this man looks like the one Auntie Ada brought medicine for. She came about 2 months ago asking for painkillers and antibiotics. Said she was caring for a man who had been in some kind of accident. He had a bad head wound and broken ribs. She could not afford much, so I gave her what I could at cost." Sergeant Danladi felt his pulse quicken. He asked for directions to Ada's house. The pharmacist pointed him toward the road leading out of the market, And within 30 minutes, the retired sergeant was standing outside a modest blue house with chipped paint and a yard full of plantain trees. He did not approach immediately. He observed from across the road, watching as a tall man in simple clothes emerged from the house carrying a bucket of water on his shoulder. The man's face matched the photograph, though he was thinner and had a visible scar on his forehead. Sergeant Danladi called Chidinma that same evening. Danladi, I found him. He's alive. He is in a small town called Ikenne, living with a woman and her family. He appears to be in good health, but something is off. He does not seem to recognize himself. The people here call him Obiora. Chidinma sat in her apartment in Victoria Island, Lagos, holding the phone to her ear, and for the first time in 3 months, she allowed herself to cry. Chidinma moved with the precision of a woman who understood that speed and secrecy were the only weapons she had. She could not go to the police because Victor had connections in the force. She could not go to the board because the board had already been compromised. She could not go to the media because without Chidubem's own testimony, it would be her word against a billion-naira machine. She needed Chidubem himself, alive, visible, and present. Even without his memory, his physical existence would be enough to challenge Toby's claim to the company and trigger an independent investigation. So Chidinma assembled a team. She reached out to 3 members of Chidubem's original security detail, who had been quietly dismissed by Tobe in the weeks following the accident. She contacted a lawyer she trusted, a woman named Barrister Adaize Obi, who specialized in corporate fraud, and she rented 7 black SUVs. The convoy was not a show of force. It was a show of legitimacy. In the world Chidubem came from, perception was power. If she arrived in Ikenne in a taxi, no one would take her seriously. But 7 SUVs, each carrying personnel with a specific function, lawyers, security, a private physician, and Chidinma herself. That was a statement. That was a declaration that the rightful CEO of Adeyemi Holdings was not dead, and the people who tried to bury him had failed. And so, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, the convoy rolled into Ikenne, turning heads and raising dust, and pulled up in front of a modest blue house where a vegetable seller, her daughter, her arthritic mother, and a man who did not know his own name were sitting down to a lunch of rice and stew. We have now arrived back where this story began. Ada stood on the porch, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the woman in the cream suit could hear it. 7 SUVs, men in dark suits, a lawyer, a doctor, all of them converging on her tiny compound, like a wave about to break. The woman in the cream suit, who Ada would later learn was Chidinma Eze, repeated her question. Chidinma, are you the one they call Ada? The woman who has been sheltering a man you found on the roadside 3 months ago? Ada, I did not shelter him. I saved his life. There is a difference. Chidinma studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. There was respect in that nod, however slight. Chidinma, you are right, and for that you have the gratitude of many people. But the man you saved is not who you think he is. His name is not Obiora. His name is Chidubem Adeyemi, and he is the CEO of one of the largest companies in West Africa. He was the victim of an attack arranged by people within his own organization. And for the past 3 months, the world has believed he is dead. Ada felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not literally, but something inside her foundation cracked. The man she had nursed back to health, the man who fixed her roof and helped her daughter with fractions and held her hand on the porch at sunset, was a billionaire, a public figure, a man whose disappearance had apparently made national news, though Ada did not own a television and rarely had electricity to charge her phone long enough to browse the internet. The door behind her opened, and Obiora stepped onto the porch. He had heard the commotion and come to investigate. When Chidinma saw him, her composure cracked for the first time. Her professional mask slipped, and what emerged was raw, undiluted relief. Chidinma, sir, it is you. Thank God you are alive. Obiora looked at her with the blank, searching expression that Ada had come to know so well. He was trying. His brain was reaching into the darkness, grasping for something familiar. Chidinma's face, her voice, the way she stood. Something was there, hovering at the edge of recognition, but it would not come into focus. Obiora, I am sorry. I do not know who you are. I do not remember. The private physician who had come with the convoy, a neurologist named Dr. Okafor, stepped forward and introduced himself. He asked Obiora a series of questions, examined his eyes, tested his reflexes, and gently probed the scar on his forehead. After a thorough assessment, he turned to Chidinma and spoke quietly, though Ada heard every word. Dr. Okafor, the amnesia is consistent with a severe traumatic brain injury. The fact that he has retained procedural memory, skills, knowledge, and the ability to function while losing episodic memory, personal history, and identity suggests damage to the hippocampal region. Recovery is possible, but it requires proper medical attention, which he has clearly not had access to. The woman who cared for him did a remarkable job with the resources available, but he needs an MRI, a full neurological workup, and possibly rehabilitation therapy. Ada stood to the side during this assessment, watching the scene unfold with the surreal detachment of someone watching a play in which they have suddenly realized they are not the protagonist, but a supporting character who is about to be written out. Zuri, who had been peering through the window, came outside and stood next to her mother. She looked at the SUVs, the suited men, the doctor, and then at Obiora. Zuri, "Mama, are they taking Obiora away?" Ada placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder, but did not answer. She did not trust her voice. What happened next is the part of the story that separates it from every predictable narrative you have ever heard. In most stories like this, the rich man recovers his memory, returns to his world, and either forgets the poor woman entirely or sends her a check as a thank you gesture, reducing an act of profound human compassion to a financial transaction. The audience feels a bittersweet pang, the credits roll, and everyone moves on.
Thank you for saving me that day when I'm glad you did.
The credits roll, and everyone moves on. Chidinma Adeyemi, even without his memory, was not most men. After Chidinma explained the situation, after the doctor completed his assessment, after Barrister Adaize Obi outlined the legal urgency of returning to Lagos to challenge Toba's control of the company, Obiora did something no one in the convoy expected. He turned to Ada. "Obiora, Ada, can we speak? Just you and me. Before I go anywhere or do anything, I need to talk to you." They walked to the backyard, past the basin where Ada washed cassava, past the small garden of tomatoes and peppers, to the wooden bench under the mango tree, where they had spent so many evenings talking. Chidinma and the team waited in front. This was not their moment. Obiora sat down and took a breath. "Obiora, I do not remember being Chidinma Adeyemi. I do not remember the company, the money, or the people who are apparently waiting for me. But I remember everything that has happened in this house. I remember every meal you cooked for me, every bandage you changed, every time you sat with me during a headache and hummed that song until the pain stopped. I remember Zuri's laughter and Mama Nkechi's stubbornness and the sound of rain on this roof. Those are my real memories. Those are the only ones I have, and they all belong to you." Ada listened without interruption. Her eyes were steady, but her hands, clasped together in her lap, were trembling. "Obiora, I have to go back. I understand that. If what that woman says is true, there are people who tried to destroy me, and there are 12,000 employees whose livelihoods depend on a company that has apparently been hijacked. I cannot ignore that. But Ada, I need you to hear me say this clearly, because I may not have another chance to say it without a dozen people listening. I am not leaving you. I am going back to fix something that is broken. But I am coming back. I do not care what the world says about who I am supposed to be. I know who I want to be, and the man I want to be is the one who lives in this house." Ada finally looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set with the same quiet strength that had carried her through widowhood, poverty, and the relentless daily battle of survival. "Ada, do not make promises you cannot keep. The world you are about to return to will remind you of who you were before me, and that man might not want the things that Obiora wants. I need you to be prepared for that. Obiora, and I need you to be prepared for the possibility that the man I was before might have been a fool, and the man I am now, the one you helped create, might be the better version." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a seed from the mango tree, dried and smooth from weeks of him absent-mindedly rolling it in his fingers. He placed it in Ada's palm. "Obiora, plant this, and when the tree grows tall enough to give shade, I will be sitting under it. That is my promise." Ada closed her fingers around the seed. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She simply held it tightly and nodded once. Sometimes, the most powerful declarations of love are not spoken in words at all. They are pressed into the palm of a hand, a seed, a possibility, a future that has not happened yet but already feels inevitable. The return of Chidinma Adeyemi to Lagos was the corporate equivalent of a resurrection. Chidinma had orchestrated the reveal with surgical precision. Before they even left Ikenne, she had contacted 3 trusted journalists and arranged for a press conference at the Four Points Hotel in Victoria Island for the following morning. She had also filed an emergency injunction with the Federal High Court to freeze all executive decisions made by Tobe Adeyemi, pending an investigation into the circumstances of the accident and the subsequent transfer of power. When Chidinma walked into that press conference, flanked by Barrister Adaize Obi and his security team, the room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Social media exploded within minutes. The man the world had mourned for 3 months was standing at a podium, thinner than before, with a scar on his forehead and a calmness in his eyes that no one recognized. Barrister Adaize read a prepared statement outlining the evidence of fraud, the arranged accident, and the illegal seizure of the company. She named Victor Namdi and Tobechukwu Adeyemi directly. She presented financial records, communication logs, and the testimony of the whistleblower who had originally tried to reach Chidinma on the night of the attack. Within 72 hours, Victor Namdi was arrested at Murtala Mohammed International Airport while attempting to board a flight to Dubai. Tobe Adeyemi was arrested at the company's headquarters, sitting behind a desk that had never been his, signing documents he had no right to sign. The 47 billion naira they had stolen was traced across multiple accounts in 4 countries, and the process of recovery began. The media called it the biggest corporate scandal in Nigerian history. Analysts compared it to cases studied in business schools around the world. But for Chidinma, the legal and corporate battles were only the surface layer of a much deeper transformation that was happening inside him. His memory began to return in fragments over the following weeks. Medical treatment, including the MRI and rehabilitation therapy Dr. Okafor had recommended, accelerated the process. He began to remember his childhood in Enugu. He remembered his mother, a seamstress who had worked herself to the bone to put him through school. He remembered the early days of building his company, the sleepless nights, the risks, the euphoria of the first big contract. But he also remembered something else. He remembered the man he had become in the process. A man who measured people by their usefulness. A man who had stopped calling his mother because he was too busy. A man who had surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. A man who had accumulated wealth but had somehow, along the way, misplaced his humanity. The amnesia had not just taken his memories, it had given him something in return, a blank slate, a chance to experience life without the filters of status, wealth, and power. And in that blank space, in a small house in Ikenne, a woman named Ada had shown him what it meant to be treated as a human being, not as a brand or a balance sheet. Her kindness was not strategic. Her compassion was not transactional. She had given him everything she had, because that was simply who she was. And now that his memory was returning, he had a choice. He could go back to being the man he was before, efficient, profitable, and emotionally bankrupt. Or he could integrate the lessons of Ikenne into the man he was becoming. He chose the second path. The first thing Chidinma did when he regained control of Adeyemi Holdings was not what anyone expected. He did not fire people. He did not restructure for profit. He did not make a power play. He called a company-wide meeting and stood before 12,000 employees, many of whom had feared for their jobs during Tobe's chaotic interim leadership, and said something that corporate Nigeria had rarely, if ever, heard from a CEO. Chidinma, I owe every one of you an apology, not for the last 3 months, for the last several years. I built this company on ambition, and I am proud of what we have achieved together. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that. A company is not a machine. It is a community, It is families. It is 12,000 lives that depend on the decisions I make, and I have not always made those decisions with your well-being at the center. That changes today. He announced a comprehensive review of employee welfare, including healthcare expansion, salary adjustments for lower-tier staff, scholarships for employees, children, and the establishment of a community development fund that would invest in infrastructure projects in underserved communities across the country. The business press was skeptical. They called it a publicity stunt. They predicted it would hurt the bottom line. They quoted analysts who said that compassion was a liability in the corporate world. They were wrong. Within 6 months of implementing these changes, employee retention increased by 37%. Productivity rose by 22%. The company's public image, tarnished by the scandal, was not only restored but elevated. Adeyemi Holdings became a case study in what happens when leadership prioritizes people over profit, and the results, ironically, were more profitable than the old model had ever been. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond the boardroom. When you invest in people, people invest in you. When you build systems based on dignity and mutual respect, those systems are stronger, more resilient, and more sustainable than anything built on exploitation and fear. This is not idealism. It is mathematics. Happy, valued, respected people do better work. It is that simple. 6 weeks after his return to Lagos, Chidinma kept his promise. He went back to Ikenne. He did not go with 7 SUVs this time. He went in one car, with one driver, and he wore jeans and a simple white shirt. He did not call ahead. He did not send a team to prepare the way. He simply showed up at Ada's door, the way he had shown up the first time, unexpected, unannounced, and utterly certain that this was where he needed to be. Ada was in the backyard, tending her garden. She had planted the mango seed the day after he left. It had not sprouted yet, but she watered the spot every morning anyway, as if her consistency alone could coax life from the soil. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, and there he was, thinner in the face from the stress of the past weeks, but standing taller, as if the weight he carried was no longer pressing down on him, but was balanced across broader shoulders. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Words felt inadequate. Language felt like a blunt instrument, trying to describe something precise. Chidinma, the mango seed. Did you plant it? Ada, I did. It has not sprouted yet. Chidinma, it will. Some things take time. He stepped closer. Chidinma, Ada, my memory came back. Not all of it, but most. I remember who I was, and I need you to know something. The man I was before the accident, he would have never stopped on that road. He would have never carried a bleeding stranger through the rain. He would have never given away his dinner so someone else could eat. He would have driven past in an air-conditioned car and never thought twice. I am ashamed of that man, and I am grateful to you, more grateful than words can express, because you did not just save my life that night on the road. You showed me a version of myself I did not know was possible. Ada listened. She did not interrupt. She let his words land the way rain lands on thirsty soil. Ada, I did not show you a version of yourself. I showed you who you already were underneath everything the world had stacked on top of you. The money, the power, the title, those are additions. They are not you. You are the man who sat with my daughter and taught her fractions with patience and joy. You are the man who listened to my mother's stories because you genuinely cared. You are the man who fixed the roof without being asked. That man was always there. He just needed a reason to come out. Chidinma reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Ada unfolded it and read its contents. Her eyes widened. It was a scholarship document, full funding for Zuri to attend any secondary school and university of her choice, through the newly established Adeyemi Community Education Fund. It was not charity. It was an investment, the same way Ada had invested in a stranger on a rainy night. Below the scholarship document was something else. A deed of land, 5 acres on the outskirts of Ikenne, purchased in Ada's name, designated for the construction of a community health center that would serve the town and surrounding villages. The center would be named the Emeka Okonkwo Memorial Health Center, after Ada's late husband, the teacher who believed that education was the bridge between poverty and possibility. Ada stared at the documents, Her hands were shaking. She looked up at Chidinma, and for the first time since the day she found him on the road, she allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief, but from the overwhelming realization that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe does pay attention. Ada, you named the health center after Emeka. Chidinma, he was a man who dedicated his life to others and received nothing in return from the system that should have supported him. His pension was never paid. His wife was left to struggle alone. That is not just a personal tragedy, Ada. That is a systemic failure. And if I have the resources to address even a small part of that failure, then that is what my resources should be used for. He took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the porch weeks ago. Chidinma, I am not here to rescue you, Ada. You never needed rescuing. You are the strongest person I have ever met. I am here because I want to build something with you, not for you, with you, a partnership, a life, something real. Ada looked at the mango seed plot, still bare, still waiting, but she knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had learned to trust the process of growth, that something was already taking root, not just in the soil, but in the space between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had chosen, against all odds, to stay. Ada, you want to build something with me? Then start by helping me carry water from the stream. The pipe is broken again, and no amount of money fixes things faster than two willing hands. Chidinma laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind that comes from a man who has finally found the place where his wealth and his values are no longer at war with each other. Chidinma, lead the way. And so, the billionaire CEO of a 900-billion-naira company picked up a bucket, followed a vegetable seller to the stream, and began the quiet, unglamorous, deeply human work of building a life that mattered. 1 year later, the mango seed sprouted. It was small, just a thin green shoot pushing its way through the dark soil, reaching for the sun. But it was alive, and it was growing. The Emeka Okonkwo Memorial Health Center opened its doors 6 months after construction began. It served over 3,000 patients in its first quarter alone. Families who had previously traveled over 40 kilometers for basic medical care now had access to a facility in their own community. The center employed 37 local residents and partnered with 2 teaching hospitals for specialized treatment referrals. Zuri received her scholarship and enrolled in a top secondary school in Obiora. She thrived. Her mathematics scores were among the highest in her class, a fact she attributed, with the unapologetic confidence of a 12-year-old, to a man named Obiora, who once sat at her kitchen table and made fractions feel like a game. Mama Nkichi's arthritis was being managed with proper medication for the first time in 7 years. She still grumbled. She still criticized. But she also smiled more, and on quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch with Chidinma and tell him stories about the old days. And he would listen with the same genuine attention that had made her warm to him in the first place. Ada continued to sell vegetables at the Ikenne market, not because she needed to financially, but because the market was her community, and she was not the kind of woman who abandoned her community simply because her circumstances changed. She used her new resources to help other market women access microloans, to improve sanitation facilities at the market, and to fund a literacy program for women who, like her, had been denied the education they deserved. She and Chidinma built their relationship slowly, deliberately, with the patience of people who understood that real love is not a lightning bolt but a sunrise. It arrives gradually, illuminating everything in its path, and by the time you realize how bright it has become, you cannot imagine the world without it. Victor Namdi was sentenced to 14 years in prison for fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to attempted murder. Tobechukwu Adeyemi received 18 years. The trial lasted 5 months and became a landmark case in Nigerian corporate law, establishing new precedents for whistleblower protection and executive accountability. Chidinma Eze was promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Adeyemi Holdings. She was the first woman to hold a C-suite position in the company's history. She earned it not through connections or favors, but through the courage to trust her instincts when every piece of conventional logic told her to accept the official story and move on. And Chidinma, the man who had lost everything and found himself in the most unlikely of places, he still went back to Ikenne every month. He still sat under the growing mango tree with Ada. He still helped Zuri with her homework when she visited on weekends. And he still carried water from the stream when the pipe broke, which it did regularly because some things in life are not meant to be fixed permanently. They are meant to be attended to repeatedly with patience and care, the same way you attend to a relationship, a community, or a life. Sergeant Danladi, the retired police officer who had tracked Chidinma down, was offered a permanent position as the head of corporate security at Adeyemi Holdings. He declined. He said he preferred working alone, following his instincts, and eating lunch at whatever roadside buka he happened to pass. Chidinma respected that. Instead, he put Danladi on a generous retainer as a private consultant and sent him a Christmas hamper every December that was so large it took Danladi's 3 grown sons to carry it inside. The pharmacist in Ikenne, the one who had given Ada antibiotics at cost price because he saw a woman trying to save a stranger's life and decided to help, received a grant from the Adeyemi Community Fund to expand his pharmacy into a full dispensary. He never forgot that his small act of generosity had been the thread that connected a retired sergeant to a missing billionaire. He told that story to every customer who walked through his door, and each time he told it, the lesson grew richer. No act of kindness, however small, is ever wasted. You never know which thread you are pulling. You never know which door you are opening. As for the people of Ikenne, the story of Ada and the man she found on the road became part of the town's folklore. Mothers told it to their children as a bedtime story. Market women referenced it when they wanted to remind each other that dignity and wealth are not the same thing. The elders invoked it during town hall meetings when decisions needed to be made about how the community treated strangers and outsiders. The story became a mirror, reflecting back to the town its own capacity for goodness. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about a billionaire who lost his memory. It is not about a poor woman who took him in. It is not even about the 7 SUVs that showed up on a Tuesday afternoon and shattered the quiet rhythm of a simple life. This story is about the things we value and the things we overlook. It is about a world that measures worth in naira and dollars and forgets that the richest people on earth are often the ones with the least money in their pockets. It is about the fact that kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, the kind that requires sacrifice, is the most undervalued currency in human civilization. Ada did not save Chidinma because she expected a reward. She saved him because that is who she is. And that single act of unselfish compassion set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just 2 lives but an entire community. There are people in your life right now who are waiting to be seen, not for what they can offer you, not for what they can do for you, but for who they are. The question is, will you see them? Will you stop, even when it is inconvenient, even when it costs you something, and extend your hand? Because you never know. The person lying on the side of your road might just change your life, and you might just change theirs. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. And remember, the greatest investment you will ever make is the one you make in another person.